Well, Paul Preston has insisted, I mean, he's very disappointed he's not going to be here. Not least because, as he put it in an email he sent to us this week confirming he couldn't make it, that when delivering his lectures he likes to extemporise in the style, as he put it, of Eric Morecambe. That makes me the only wise of this I'll deliver his lines as a straight man and straight from the page. So here we go. George Orwell and the Spanish Civil War by Paul Preston. These are the words he would have delivered today when he's standing here instead of me. For what it's worth, my view of the problem concerning Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, and by extension its cinematic version, Ken Loach's film Land and Freedom, lies not so much in what they say, but in their audiences and how they are perceived. Orwell's book is an interesting eyewitness account by a partial witness of a tiny fragment of the Spanish Civil War. If I were assembling a list of, say, 100 or so important books on the war, I would certainly include it. However, I would not do so as a reliable overview of the war, nor even of the central debate over whether the Spanish Republic should have made its priority revolution and not a conventional war effort against Franco and his Axis allies. I would include it just as I would include Spike Milligan's Hitler, My Part in His Downfall in a long list of books on the Second World War as a worm's eye view by a foot soldier. Unfortunately, however, for thousands of people, Homage to Catalonia is the only book on the Spanish Civil War that they will ever read. Its year-on-year sales show that it outsells any other single book on that war. So it is not a question of denigrating Orwell, but rather of raising awareness that his perceptions are often wrong, precisely because they are so narrow and so localised. Orwell's book, in isolation, gives the impression that the key events of the Spanish Civil War took place on the Aragon front and during the May days of 1937, and most misleading of all, promotes the idea that the Spanish Republic was defeated because of communist policy. Orwell's book makes it too easy to forget that the Spanish Republic was defeated by Franco, Hitler, Mussolini, and the pusillanimity and narrow-mindedness of the British, American, and French governments. Stalin has a lot to answer for, but not Franco's victory. And the "not" is in capitals. George Orwell was one of the roughly 35,000 volunteers who went to Spain and thus were among the first in something about the fascist menace. Italian, German, and Austrian refugees saw the Spanish Civil War as their first chance to fight back against fascism. The French, who were the most numerous contingent, the British and the North American volunteers went to Spain out of concern about what defeat for the Republic might mean for the rest of the world. They were the first in the field in a war which would not end until 1945. These so-called premature anti-fascists were reviled on their return home to Britain, treated as the scum of the earth in French internment camps, or regarded as dangerous and un-American in the United States. Despite this, the surviving volunteers fought in the Second World War. After all, the anti-fascist war was their war. They were not bitter about the lack of universal recognition of their contribution to the defeat of fascism. However, I remember vividly talking to British and American volunteers about their outrage at the belief fostered by the success of Ken Loach's Land and Freedom that the fight of the brigaders and of the Spanish people was not a fight against Spanish fascism and its German and Italian allies, but rather part of an internecine leftist civil war in which the central villain was the Communist Party. For all their many merits, Orwell's book and Loach's script failed to underline two central facts about the Spanish Civil War. In its origins, it was a Spanish social war, and in its course and outcome, it was an episode in a greater European civil war that ended in 1945. This annual tribute to the memory of Len Crome is an appropriate moment to reflect on why Orwell and those influenced by him distort the nature of the Spanish Republic's heroic defence against an ultimate defeat at the hands of the forces of international fascism. Neither Homage to Catalonia nor Ken Loach's cinematically excellent film about the fate of a small Trotskyist militia unit fighting on the quiet and peripheral Aragon front should be regarded as explaining anything much about the wider issues of the Spanish Civil War. When the Spanish Republic was established in Spain on the 14th of April 1931, people thronged the streets of Spain's cities in an outburst of anticipatory joy. The new regime raised inordinate hopes among the most humble members of society and was seen as a threat by the most privileged, the landowners, the industrialists and the bankers and their defenders in the armed forces and the church. For the first time, control of the apparatus of the state had passed from the oligarchy to the moderate left. This consisted of representatives of the most reformist section of the organised working class, the socialists, and a mixed bag of petty bourgeois republicans, some of whom were idealists and many of whom were cynics. Together, they hoped, despite considerable disagreement over the finer details, to use state power to create a new Spain by curtailing the reactionary influence of the church and the army, by the break-up of the great estates, or latifundios, and by granting the autonomy demands of Basque and Catalan regionalists. These hopes and the atmosphere of popular fiesta which had greeted the coming of the Republic were soon blunted by the strength of the old order's defences. Social and economic power, ownership of the land, the banks and industry, as well as of the principal newspapers and radio stations, remained unchanged. Those who held that power were united with the church and army in being determined to prevent any attacks on property, religion or national unity. Their repertoire of defence was rich and varied. Propaganda through the right's powerful press networks and from the pulpit of every parish church denounced the efforts of the progressive leaders of the Republic to carry out reform as a subversive work of Moscow. New political parties were founded and lavishly funded to mount a legalist defence of the interests of the most powerful sections of society. Conspiracies were hatched to overthrow the new regime. Government and trade union officials who sought to implement the Republic's timid agrarian reforms were terrorised by thugs in the pay of the big landowners. Rural and industrial lockouts became a regular response to legislation aimed at protecting worker interests. So successful were the obstacles erected to reform that by 1933 the Republican Socialist coalition began to break up. In an electoral system which heavily favoured coalitions, the decision of the Socialists to go it alone in the elections of November 1933 was a tragic error. It gave power to a right wing determined to dismantle the Republic's social reforms. Employers and landowners celebrated the victory by cutting wages, sacking workers, evicting tenants and raising rents. Social legislation was dismantled and one after another the principal unions were weakened as strikes were provoked and crushed, including a harsh repression of a nationwide agricultural labour stoppage in the summer of 1934. The left saw fascism in every action of the right, while the right smelt revolution in every left-wing move. The socialists threatened a revolutionary rising in the hope of forestalling the destruction of the Republic. When the right-wing CEDA, the CEDA party, joined the government on the 6th of October 1934, the Socialist Trade Union, the Unión General de Trabajadores, the UGT, called a general strike, which in most parts of Spain was a failure, largely because of the swift declaration of martial law and the hesitance of socialist leaders who had not expected their bluff to be called. In Barcelona, an independent state of Catalonia, in quotes, within the Federal Republic of Spain, was short-lived. However, in the mining valleys of Asturias, spontaneous rank-and-file militancy impelled the local socialist leaders to go along with a revolutionary movement organised jointly by the UGT, the anarcho-syndicalist CNT, and belatedly the communists, united in the Alianza Obrera, the Workers' Alliance. For 3 weeks, a revolutionary commune heroically held out against repressive forces coordinated by General Franco, until finally the miners were reduced to submission both by heavy artillery attacks and bombing raids. The savage repression that followed the defeat of the Asturian uprising was to be the cauldron in which the Popular Front was born, although its ambitions were to be anything but revolutionary. Throughout 1935, mass pressure built up for a revival of the 1931 Republican Socialist electoral coalition. At the same time, the small Spanish Communist Party, prompted by Moscow's anxiety for an understanding with the democracies against the aggressive ambitions of the Third Reich, found a place in an electoral front which, contrary to rightist propaganda, was not, in Spain, a Comintern creation. Nevertheless, it did take the title of Popular Front, coined at the 7th Congress of the Comintern in August 1935. The left and centre-left closed ranks on the basis of a programme of amnesty for prisoners, of basic social and educational reform, and trade union freedom. Elections were called for mid-February 1936. The right enjoyed enormous financial advantages in mounting a campaign aimed at frightening the middle classes. The elections were presented as a life or death fight between good and evil, survival and destruction. The Popular Front based its campaign on the threat of fascism, the dangers facing the Republic, and the need for an amnesty for prisoners of October 1934. The elections were held on the 16th of February 1936 and resulted in a narrow victory for the left in terms of votes and a massive triumph in terms of seats in the Cortes, the Spanish Parliament. Thus, the rising of October 1934 and the Popular Front victory shattered right-wing hopes of being able to impose an authoritarian, corporative state without having to fight the civil war. Following the Popular Front victory, right-wing propaganda played up social unrest, both in parliamentary speeches and the press, to create the atmosphere which made a military rising appear to the middle classes as the only alternative to catastrophe. At the same time, 2 years of aggressive rightist government had left the working masses, especially in the countryside, in a determined and vengeful mood. However, the central factor in the spring of 1936 was the fatal weakness of the Popular Front government itself. Opposing collaboration in government, the leader of the socialist movement, Francisco Largo Caballero, fearful of a rank-and-file drift to the anarcho-syndicalist CNT, insisted that the liberal Republicans should govern alone. He fondly believed that they would carry out the Popular Front's electoral programme, then, having reached their bourgeois limitations, would make way for an all-out socialist government. He was also confident that if their reforms provoked a fascist and/or military uprising, it would be defeated by the revolutionary actions of the masses. Thus, by using his power to prevent Indalecio Prieto forming a government, Largo Caballero ensured that there would be no real popular front to combat the military rising that took place on the evening of the 17th of July 1936 in Spain's Moroccan colony and in the peninsula itself on the morning of the 18th of July. The plotters were confident that it would all be over in a few days. Had they just had the Republican government to contend with, their predictions might have come true. In fact, Spain divided in terms of the electoral geography of February. The coup was successful in the Catholic smallholding areas which had voted for the CEDA. However, in the left-wing strongholds of industrial Spain and the greater states of the Deep South, the uprising was defeated by the spontaneous action of the working class organisations. Within a matter of days, the country was split into two war zones, and there was every reason to suppose that the Republic would be able to crush the rising. While power in the streets lay with the workers and their militia organisations, there was still a bourgeois Republican government which had legitimacy in the international arena. It had control of the nation's gold and currency reserves and virtually all of Spain's industrial capacity. There was not that much to choose between the armed forces of both sides. There would, however, be two big differences which would eventually make all the difference between the two sides. First, the ferocious Army of Africa, the Spanish Foreign Legion, and secondly, the help of the fascist powers. At first, the colonial army under Franco was blockaded in Morocco by the fleet. However, while the Republican government in Madrid met only hesitance from its sister Popular Front government in France and covert hostility from London, Franco was quickly able to persuade the local representatives of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy that he was the man. By the end of July, Junkers 52 and Savoia Marchetti transport aircraft were arriving to permit the airlift of the bloodthirsty Foreign Legion across the Strait of Gibraltar. That crucial early aid was soon followed by a regular stream of high-technology assistance. In contrast to the state-of-the-art equipment arriving from Germany and Italy, complete with technicians, spare parts, and the correct workshop manuals, the Republic, shunned by the democracies, had to make do with overpriced and obsolete equipment from private arms dealers. The initial reaction of the Soviet Union had been one of deep embarrassment. The Kremlin did not want the events in Spain to undermine its delicately laid plans for an alliance with France. However, by mid-August, it was apparent that an even greater disaster would befall those plans if the Spanish Republic fell. That would severely alter the European balance of power, leaving France with three fascist states on her borders. Eventually, it was reluctantly decided to send help. The tanks and planes which arrived in the autumn were, together with the arrival of the international brigades, to save Madrid in November 1936. However, they were also to be used to justify the intervention of Hitler and Mussolini. The motivation of both of these was principally to undermine the Anglo-French hegemony of international relations, but they were sure of a sympathetic ear in London when they claimed to be fighting Bolshevism. Accordingly, the Spanish Republic was fighting not only Franco and his armies, but also, to an ever greater degree, the military and economic might of Mussolini and Hitler. Besieged from outside, the Republic also had massive internal problems unknown in Franco's brutally militarized zone. The crumpling of the bourgeois state in the first days of the war saw the rapid emergence of revolutionary organs of parallel power. A massive popular collectivization of agriculture and industry took place, exhilarating to participants and observers like George Orwell and Franz Borkenauer. The great collectivist experiments of the autumn of 1936 did little to create a war machine. That would lie at the heart of the undeclared civil war which would rage within the Republican zone until mid-1937. Socialist leaders like Indalecio Prieto and Juan Negrin were convinced that a conventional state with central control of the economy and the institutional instruments of mass mobilization was essential if there was to be an efficacious war effort. The communists and the Soviet advisors agreed. Not only was this common sense, but the playing down of the revolutionary activities of Trotsky. Of course, Stalin did not do so out of any idealism or sentiment. Rather, the case was that, threatened by expansionist Germany, he was hoping, like his Tsarist predecessors, to limit the threat by seeking an encircling alliance with France. He feared, rightly, that if Franco won the war with the help of Hitler, if Franco won the war with the help of Hitler, France would crumble. Accordingly, he set out to give sufficient aid to the Republic to keep it alive while ensuring that the revolutionary elements on the left were prevented from provoking the conservative decision-makers in London from supporting the Axis in an anti-Bolshevik crusade. It is appalling that the revolutionary élan of the Spanish people, the Republic's greatest asset, should have been squandered. Or that the sincere revolutionaries of the POUM, the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, should have been smeared as Nazi agents and bloodily suppressed by the agents of the Soviet secret police, the NKVD. The Republic's quest for respectability did nothing to alter the contempt felt in Whitehall in the Spanish Republic. Both Orwell and Loach simplify massively in their underlying assumption that it was the Stalinist repression that led to Franco's victory. Hitler, Mussolini, Franco and Chamberlain were responsible for that victory, not Stalin. As Orwell himself wrote later in his 1943 essay, looking back on the Spanish Civil War, he quotes, "The outcome of the Spanish Civil War was settled in London, Paris, Rome, Berlin, at any rate not in Spain." It is difficult to imagine how a revolutionary Spain could have succeeded without the support of Russian arms. Indeed, without Russian arms and the international brigades, Madrid would probably have fallen in November 1936, and Franco would have been victorious before the anarchists and Trotskyists of Barcelona became an issue. Neither Orwell nor Loach had the benefit of acquaintanceship with later historiography on the subject of the Barcelona events of May 1937. Before the events chronicled by Orwell came to a head, social and political tensions had been mounting for some months. By this stage, the, in quotes, proletarian content of the initial revolutionary stages of the struggle had been severely emasculated. Increasingly, the communists, the republicans, and the reformist socialists were taking command of the political and military structures of the republic. In Catalonia, the regional government, the Generalitat, was systematically recovering the powers lost when the military coup undermined the apparatus of the state. In Spain as a whole, the trend towards the creation of a conventional state capable of fighting a conventional war constituted a challenge to the left socialist followers of Largo Caballero, the anarchists and the POUM. Until ousted by communists in December 1936, the POUM leader, Andreu Nin, had been Minister of Justice in the Generalitat. The anarchists and the POUM felt that the sacrifices, such as the removal of Nin, demanded by the communists in favour of a bourgeois republic were pointless, since the Western powers believed that Franco was a better bet for Western capitalism than the republic could ever be. The Generalitat's efforts to claw back its powers from the revolutionary unions were already creating considerable tension. This was dramatically exacerbated by the context of economic and social distress caused by the war itself. The population of Barcelona had been swelled by 10% by the arrival of 350,000 refugees. Shortages and inflation were kept under control in the short term by the CNT's supply committees, which requisitioned food in the countryside and distributed it to the urban poor. Inevitably, the actions of the CNT in imposing low prices led to peasants hoarding food. The consequent shortages and food price inflation led to bread riots in Barcelona. The Catalan president, Luis Companys, was already on a collision course with the CNT. Determined to put an end to anarchist excesses, he had re-established conventional police forces in October 1936. Moreover, in the interests of the war effort, Companys was anxious to establish central control of industry. Companys' stance on all these issues was strongly supported by the Catalan communists of the PSUC, which for a variety of reasons was already campaigning for the removal of the POUM from the Catalan government. Like Companys, the PSUC leadership believed that the POUM was counter-revolutionary and that its call for a revolutionary workers' front with the CNT was undermining the war effort. Moreover, at a dinner on the 12th of December 1936 with Companys, the Russian Consul General in Barcelona, Vladimir Antonov Ovseyenko, stressed that continued Soviet aid required evidence that obstacles to a unified war effort were being removed. On the 16th of December, Companys reshuffled his cabinet. He put Joan Comarera of the PSUC in charge of supply as the first step towards a return to the free market. Conflict with the Esquerra, the left Republican Party of Luis Companys, and the PSUC on the one hand, and the CNT committees on the other, was only a matter of time. The POUM was being singled out for the enmity of the communists precisely because of the views which, while not strictly Trotskyist, given Andrei Nin's complex relationship with Trotsky himself, could easily be presented as such. The party had made itself even more of a target by dint of its outspoken public criticisms of the trial and execution of the old Bolsheviks, Kamenev and Zinoviev. Their accusations that the communists had betrayed the revolution in Spain was seen as a declaration of war. Encouraged by Antonov Ovseyenko, the communists began to call for the extermination of the POUM and to denounce, as enemies of the USSR, fascist spies and Trotskyist agents, those who criticized the Moscow trials. Blindly following the Soviet leadership, Spanish communists were convinced that the trials were genuinely directed against enemies of the people. Moreover, after the Republican defeat at Malaga in February 1937, the Russians, and particularly the newly arrived Comintern delegate Boris Stepanov, became obsessed with the notion that there had been sabotage and treachery. Inevitably, this put the spotlight on the local Trotskyists, the POUM. However, the notorious persecution of the POUM has to be seen in the context of the Russians' concern, shared by Spanish Republicans and Socialists, as well as Communists, that the war effort needed to be more disciplined and centralized. The Russians used their influence to insist that in quotes, experiments in industry and especially among the peasantry be abandoned. In the context of the time and the light of the POUM's provocatively subversive criticisms of the Generalitat, it was almost inevitable that POUM militia units were starved of arms. Orwell and others complained that POUM units at the front had to make do with tattered uniforms, bad equipment, and inadequate supplies of food and ammunition. In contrast, the communist units in Barcelona, who spent their time harassing the POUM, were well equipped. As Orwell put it, a government which sends boys of 15 to the front with rifles 40 years old and keeps the biggest men and the newest weapons in the rear is manifestly more afraid of the revolution than of the fascists. However, Orwell, inevitably given his lowly position in a POUM militia, was not seeing the bigger picture. The growing tide of refugees into Catalonia was putting increasing pressure on food supplies. Comorera's liberalisation of the market permitted rural producers to raise their prices, but that didn't resolve the issue since Catalonia needed to import food and simply did not have the foreign currency to do so. Despite rationing, shortages, inflation, speculation, and the growth of a black market caused bitter social tension. At the same time, the Generalitat and the PSUC were in conflict with the CNT and the POUM over control of war industries and armaments. Rural and industrial collectivizations, the militarization of the militias, and public order. Both sides claimed that violent mass demonstrations by women against rising food and fuel prices supported their case. Tension was heightened from mid-March when the Generalitat made a definitive push to take control of public order, dissolving the CNT's security patrols and demanding that all workers' organizations surrender their arms. The CNT then withdrew from the government of the Generalitat. Tension was screwed even higher when one of the many consequent clashes on the 25th of April 1937 saw the assassination of Roldan Cortada, a member of the PSUC and secretary to Rafael Vidiella, Minister for Labour and Public Works for the Generalitat. A few days later, the leader of the local CNT committee in Puigcerdà, Antonio Martin, known as El Cojo de Malaga, the cripple from Malaga, and two other anarchists died in a shootout with a detachment of carabineros, the frontier guards, who were under the jurisdiction of the Minister of Finance, Juan Negrín. The collectives were being brought under government control. There were clashes between the CNT patrols and the security patrols. Communist secret police units began to pick up POUM militants. By April 1937, tension in Catalonia was reaching extreme levels. In consequence, the Generalitat decreed the prohibition of the traditional May Day rallies. This was perceived as a provocation by the CNT rank and file. In early May, the crisis exploded. The immediate catalyst of the May events was the raid on the CNT-controlled central telephone exchange in Barcelona, ordered on the 3rd of May by Eusebio Rodriguez Salas, PSUC Police Commissioner for Catalonia. Coming in the wake of deteriorating conditions and police heavy-handedness over the previous 3 months, this led to the outbreak of street fighting, a small-scale civil war within the civil war. This could have been averted had the Generalitat pulled back the forces surrounding the telephone building, but companies took the opportunity to continue the offensive against the CNT. He told the press, in quotes, "There are armed groups on the streets and there is no choice but to disperse them." He underestimated the scale of the popular resistance to the campaign to reassert the power of the state. Barricades went up in the centre of Barcelona. The CNT, the POUM, and the extreme anarchist group, the Friends of Durruti, confronted the forces of the Generalitat and the PSUC for several days. Working class districts and industrial suburbs were in the hands of the anarchist masses, but their lack of coordination gave the advantage back to companies. Although the origins of the May Days lay deep in the wartime circumstances of Catalonia and their impact on the poorest members of society, the central government, the Generalitat and the PSUC, were not slow to seize opportunities to advance their own agendas. The communists and Prieto were delighted to have a chance to break the power of the CNT and limit that of the Generalitat. The fighting exposed the central dilemma of the CNT. The anarchists could win in Barcelona and other Catalan cities only at the cost of bloodshed and effectively lose the war for the Republic. They could hold on only by recalling their troops from Aragon and then having to fight both the Central Republican government and the Francoists. Accordingly, Juan García Oliver, the anarchist Minister of Justice, made a broadcast from the Generalitat on behalf of the CNT leadership, calling on the incredulous militants to lay down their arms. The government in Valencia provided the decisive police reinforcements on the 7th of May, which finally decided the outcome. It did so only in return for the Generalitat surrendering autonomous control of the army of Catalonia and responsibility for public order. Several hundred members of the CNT and the POUM were arrested, although the need to get the war industries working again limited the scale of the repression. All this was happening as the Basque Country was falling to Franco. This left the POUM as the sacrificial goat. Andreu Nin and the rest of the POUM leadership had far exceeded the CNT in the militancy of their revolutionary pronouncements during the crisis. In victory, the communists were anything but magnanimous. They would settle for nothing less than the complete destruction of the POUM. Orwell noted that, again quoting, there was a peculiar evil feeling in the air, an atmosphere of suspicion, fear, uncertainty, and veiled hatred. Nin was murdered by a small squad of NKVD agents. Immediately, the fighting in Barcelona was over. The communists demanded that the Largo Caballero government dissolve the POUM and arrest its leadership. Largo refused. For the communists, this confirmed their belief that Largo must go. He was forced to resign, and the government was offered to Juan Negrín. In a sense, this marked an end to the power struggle between the revolutionists and the communists. From this point on, the revolutionary achievements of the initial stages of the struggle would be steadily dismantled, leaving the war to follow the direction dictated by the Republicans and moderate socialists who had taken over the key ministries in the government. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that Orwell knew little of any of this, neither during his time on the Aragon front nor during his brief sojourn in Barcelona. When he returned to England and began to write, he was exhausted. The American novelist John Dos Passos, who bumped into him as he was about to leave the Catalan capital, described Orwell as a gangling Englishman with his arm in a sling. He was wearing a threadbare uniform, a squashed overseas cap on the side of his head nestled in abundant wavy black hair. His long face had a sick, drawn look. I suppose he was already suffering from the tuberculosis that later killed him. He seemed inexpressibly weary. To conclude, despite vilification, defeat, and the bitter frustration of witnessing the culpable negligence of the democracies, almost all those who supported the cause of the Spanish Republic carried for the rest of their lives the conviction that they had participated in a struggle that mattered. It was a feeling shared even by Orwell, whose memoir of his brief time in Spain has given much succour to those who wish to claim, whether from the far left or the far right, that the defeat of the Spanish Republic was somehow more the responsibility of Stalin than of Franco, Hitler, Mussolini, or Neville Chamberlain. On leaving Spain, Orwell stayed for 3 days in the French fishing port of Banyuls. He and his wife, in quotes, thought, talked, dreamed incessantly of Spain. Although bitter about what he had seen as a foot soldier with the semi-Trotskyist POUM, Orwell claimed to feel neither disillusionment nor cynicism. He said, "Curiously enough, the whole experience has left me with not less, but more belief in the decency of human beings."